Welcome back to the Shema podcast, my friends. I have the great Rabbi Tovia Singer with us again, and I asked him to come on as a continuation of what we discussed last time. If you recall, I wanted him to explain what is it that the Christian missionaries are doing? How are they succeeding? Because I started this podcast 6 years ago to help Jews understand and learn that their Torah is true, that it has divine authorship. It provides them exactly with what their unique mission is in the world. But Jews are stubborn people. It's hard to convince them just to explore that reality. But yet somehow Christians are coming in and convincing them to pray to a really pretty man on a cross. And it was hurting my self-esteem as a salesperson. And I wanted to find out how are they succeeding. And what we discovered, which just makes sense, is that what the Jewish neshama wants very desperately is to connect to their creator, find a life of meaning and purpose around that central belief. And the absence of that information and the vacuum of that existing because of the horrible state of education and really the proliferation of Jewish denominations and this idea that Judaism is nothing more than a culture of people who can't order anything directly off the menu. In that vacuum, Christians are coming in and giving them this idea. So the call to action was to continue to work to educate Jews. But I asked Rabbi Singer to come on again because I had a follow-up question. You know, in the business world, companies are always looking at what's called SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats that their competition has over them. And if you can find out what your competitor thinks is a threat to them, then you know what to exploit. And I was thinking to myself, we know what Christians' leadership thinks is a threat, and it is our Talmud. And the reason we know that is because they would burn wagon loads of them over the millennia, which I can only imagine how long it would take before the printing press to write one set of Talmud. So I asked Rabbi Singer to come on and explain to us what are they afraid of and how can we use that to our advantage to get Jews to come back to Torah Judaism and not step foot in a church.
Welcome to the Shema podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights intertwined through personal stories as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. Now to the show.
So Rabbi Singer, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's so great to join you. Thank you for having me.
I like to begin with a theory I have on this. This theory came about around my Shabbos table. My daughter's freshman in college this year, and she works at a Judaic shop. And a lot of people that come in are Christians. And a lot of the stuff, I always ask, like, what are they buying? And she says that it's things like they buy shofars with oil from Israel. And she thought they were two independent purchases, but they were actually one purchase together because what she found out they were doing is putting a cork in the bottom of the shofar, pouring the oil in it, and then using it to anoint themselves, which is fine. It all goes back to Israel's economy. However, what was interesting, what got this my theory is that during December, she said they were coming in and buying Hanukkah menorahs and that they're celebrating Hanukkah. And I said, that's really strange because in the Hanukkah story, they are in essence the Greeks. From Esau came Greece, Rome, Christianity, Western civilization. The Greeks then wanted to get Jews to forgo their Torah and mitzvos. And today that seems to be a continuation of the theme with evangelical Christians, missionaries trying to get us to do the same thing. So why are they celebrating Hanukkah? It seemed bizarre to me, but what she explained to me was that they do not see themselves as descendants of Esau, but descendants of Yaakov. And sort of the 2.0 version of the Jew. And then in that story of Hanukkah, they were part and connected to the Jewish people in that saga. And I'm wondering, my theory is the reality of that, which is in the Gemara, is that something early church leaders did not want their followers to find out? And is that one of the reasons why early church leaders would burn the Talmud to protect their own followers from finding out some of these central ideas?
Well, bear in mind that if you had suggested to any of the authors of the Christian Bible that there's no oral Torah, they would have thought you were out of your mind, or they would have thought you were a Sadducee. The New Testament recognized as a heresy. Remember in the Sermon on the Mount, we are told that Jesus says that unless your righteousness is that of the Pharisees and believe in the oral Torah, not the Sadducees. So therefore, the oral Torah is all over the Christian. In fact, many passages in the New Testament would not be understood without the oral Torah, without the Talmud. The Talmud was edited in the form we have it today centuries later. In fact, the Bali Mishnah, contributing authors are in the Christian Bible. Moreover, the festival of Hanukkah is mentioned in the Christian Bible. Christmas is not in the New Testament. Christmas was celebrated on December 25th in the 4th century during the reign of Constantine. So the earliest Christians just took for granted that there was an oral Torah. With your permission, I just want to take out a moment to explain to our viewers what the oral Torah is.
Please.
Yeah, because I have a feeling, a nagging suspicion, or people watching us right now who think that, well, I know the Jews have 613 commandments, so it probably follows that a significant number of those commandments are in the written, maybe 400, and the other 213 are in the oral Torah. Nothing can be further from truth, and the oral Torah is different, not in number or anything, but it's different in kind than the written. There are no new commands in the oral Torah, but rather the oral Torah is there to guide us in how to keep the written Torah, because after all, the written Torah tells us things like when you slaughter an animal, you can't kill it in any way, but only in the manner that I have shown you. Deuteronomy 12. But if you look throughout Tanakh, you will not find this method. So the oral Torah provides the information of how to actually carry out the commandments that are found in the written Torah. All 613 commandments are contained in the 5 books of Moses. If a prophet were to add a commandment or take one away, he'd be put to death. That's a violation of Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. So the oral Torah, when the Torah says to wear fringes, which are found in the New Testament, in fact, the word phylactery first appears in any written surviving literature in the Christian Bible, Matthew 23.
Wow.
Okay, so the authors of the Christian Bible knew exactly what the oral Torah was. They also believed that the Jews who believed in the oral Torah were the protectors of God's oracle. And in fact, Matthew states explicitly that the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, and whatever they tell you to do, follow. So they have direct authority. The idea that we are going to oppose the oral Torah is not in the Christian Bible. It is a later development of the church, not much later, but it's not first century. First century Christians all knew there was an oral Torah. I mean, when the Torah says, do not leave your place on the Sabbath day, what does that even mean? Does it mean you can't leave your home? You stay inside? Is there a limit to how far you can walk from your home, from your village? Well, we know there's Tchum Shabbos, a measure of distance called the Sabbath day journey that one cannot go. If you live in a town and outside the limits of that town, you can't go further than a certain number of cubits. Well, that's found in the book of Acts. And if we measure from the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives, it's exactly that distance. So it is found in the Christian Bible. So the oral Torah is baked all over the Christian. But later on, the church would come to see it as, number one, revolting, and later and further down the pipe, it would view the oral Torah as the very thing that prevents Jews from believing in Jesus. So there's a development. And maybe, I don't, if you would like, I'll lay that out.
Yeah, but I mean, I never have studied the New Testament. But I've looked at it, and I looked at the amount of volumes of Talmud. So while the New Testament may mention and reference the oral Torah, it's obviously very selective in what it mentions, correct?
The authors of the New Testament never gave thought that there was a problem with the Oral Torah, was a part of Jewish life. So no one in the, not only that, the writers of the New Testament were keen on, there was a distinction between a biblical commandment and a rabbinic commandment, as we see in Mark 7 as an example. They knew that washing your hands is a rabbinic commandment before you eat bread. So the seven rabbinic commandments. They that distinction was very well known. Paul was a little bit more ignorant on that. And that's why I think Paul overplays his cards by insisting I'm really a Pharisee and I'm not a liar, which makes everybody see a red flag. But the Gospels are very aware of the Oral Torah, and there's no, in fact, this is going to surprise your viewers. Jesus is using the Oral Torah as a way of arguing against Jews, against Pharisees. He's trying to out-Pharisee the Pharisees. So he's, as an example, in the Synoptic Gospels, his disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath day, and Jesus' argument in defense of his followers is that it was a danger to human life. They were hungry, and after all, King David, when his life was in danger, ate sacred bread that ordinarily would be. So Jesus is always using Oral Torah to outdo his interlocutors. It's all over the. I have a whole chapter on this in volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical, where I go through this. It really is quite all over the.
Okay, interesting. So then, what changed?
What changed is a number of things. The first thing that changed was the early Christians started celebrating Easter in probably the very end of the first. And Easter, they celebrated on whenever Passover began. And the Jewish calendar determines when Passover is. Now, some of our viewers are probably scratching and going, the Bible says that Passover is on the 15th day of the first month. Why do you need an Oral Torah for that? Well, the reason you need an Oral Torah for that is because the Jewish calendar relies on both the moon and the sun, lunar and solar calendar, in order to assign when festivals are. And the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy 16, verse 1, that Passover must come out in the springtime. And you might wonder, why would that be an issue? Well, as it turns out, a lunar calendar has approximately 29 and a half days, a little bit more than that, 29 and a half days on average. And that's 354 days. And if you only use the moon and you have 12 months of the year, you lose 11 days every year. And very quickly, Passover would come out rather than the spring, would come out in the winter, fall, and slide all over the place, as the Muslim calendar.
Right.
And every 32 years, the Ramadan just slides all over. Do the numbers on that. So therefore, there's an Oral Torah that tells us how to intercalate a extra month. After all, there's no commandment in the Torah to have 12 months. And therefore, we can intercalate, add an extra month occasionally, based on a very precise number, that's Oral Torah, that ensures that the Jewish calendar is, in fact, the most accurate calendar in the world. Talmud gives, those of you who like numbers, so the actual lunar month on average is 29 and a half days. And then of the 13th hour, it's 796 over 1,080, or transposing that to a decimal is 29.53059 days. And it's on that basis that can intercalate with precision and know when Passover is. And therefore, because if we don't know when Passover is, we don't have a Jewish calendar, we don't have Judaism. Now, the early Christians celebrated Easter on when the Jews said it was Passover. It means they relied on the Oral Torah. But as you can imagine, this was becoming really quite unpleasant. It was really becoming revolting to the church. We are going to go to the Jews, the Christ killers, to tell us when we should celebrate our most holy day? And this makes its way to the Council of Nicaea. This is one of the two issues that Constantine insisted had to be resolved, and that is when Easter should be celebrated. And the Jewish calendar was rejected. Another system was embraced, one that is completely predicated on the solar calendar, and that was the official rejection of the Oral Torah, was rejecting the Jewish calendar. And because the early Christian, like second century, Polycarp celebrated Easter based on when the Jews told him it was Passover. And Constantine, in a letter that my book, famed letter, just curses the Jews and says how disgusting it is that we would ever even think of relying on those Jews who killed Christ to tell us when to celebrate our most holy and noble festival. So the Jewish calendar is oral Torah. As I explained, you have to know how to. So that's one of the reasons why the oral Torah becomes revolting to the church. And there are two other points that should be made.
Okay.
And that is that the church comes to view ritual commandments in general as revolting. Paul is antinomian. So the whole notion that you have an oral Torah, which tells you how to observe commandments, in and of itself is problematic because we're teaching you that you don't have to keep the commandments. Christ is the end of the law to everyone who believes. So it's done. So the whole oral law is a negation of Pauline theology, which shapes the way the church views the so-called Testament. These are factors that play in big.
Okay. Makes sense. Because that's one of the first mitzvos given to us is to determine the new moon and calculate the calendar. So they went to the Gregorian calendar at that time.
So there wasn't a Gregorian calendar yet. This is so cute that you brought that up. That is so interesting you said that. So there was no Gregorian calendar yet. There was a Julian calendar. But the Roman Empire did not have an oral Torah. So the Julian calendar was a mess. And it was, in fact, so it was losing time. And in 1582, Pope Gregory the 13th realizes that, in fact, the secular church calendar, they don't have Torah Shabbat Peh, they don't have an oral law. So intriguing that you said that. Assembled Jesuit scholars, scientists, who, to their credit, built a new calendar called the Gregorian calendar and omitted 11 days from the calendar. So in 1582, on, I believe it was October 10th, they skipped 11 days. So the day after October 10th was October 21st, and therefore correcting their calendar because the church had no oral Torah. Isn't that interesting? That's why it's called the Gregorian calendar. Of course, the Orthodox Church didn't like that. That's why their calendar was different. So they don't have an oral Torah. So that's where the Gregorian calendar.
Okay, so they didn't want to rely on us for determining the new moon in the month and when their Easter holiday would occur. So was there, which was basically because they didn't want to be dependent on us and they didn't believe that we need to fulfill mitzvos any longer.
Yes, and just a little tighter and deeper, and this may be the most important reason of all, and that is the oral Torah looks to the Jew as the protector of this oral transmission. The Jew is, in a sense, a living embodiment of God's oracles. Now, it actually says that in the New Testament. In Romans 3, verse 2, it says that the Jews were given the oracles of God. It actually says that in the Christian Bible. But to the church, this becomes revolting. The Christ killers, they are the protectors of the oracle, of these oral oracles. The Jews are accursed. God has rejected them. All the church fathers were vile anti, and they all were. But there was no Douglas Martin. There were no nice church fathers. So therefore, the oral Torah also.
So if there's so many positive things in the New Testament written about the Jewish people, then where does all the anti-Semitism come from?
There's nothing positive. The Christian Bible portrays Jews the way blacks are portrayed in Ku Klux Klan literature in the most horrific ways.
You're saying the New Testament just acknowledged that we are the guardians of the Torah and the oral Torah.
Right. So there's a distinction. It's very intriguing. So there's a distinction between the information the Jews convey and the nature of the Jew. So the same author, Paul, says that the Jews are against all mankind, are responsible for killing Jesus in 1 Thessalonians 2:16. 14 through 16. And the same author says, but the Jews were given the Torah. So this is a little complicated. So we do not have a monopoly on racism. There are a lot of groups that are hated, but the hatred of the Jew is very unique. Jews was always regarded as clever and knowledgeable, but they're pernicious. So the Jew in the Christian Bible is is the one who knows everything, who has all the information, but are spiritually blind in that they deny Christ. And Paul plays this up that in fact, because it's foolishness to the Jew, it must be. So the Jews are spiritually, no, like today, anti-Semites don't deny that the Jews are winning a disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes to their number. They know the Jews are clever, but that doesn't prevent them from hating the Jewish people. So in the Christian Bible, the Jews know everything, but they're like the devil himself, who too knows everything, but despite his knowledge, he's an enemy of God.
Gotcha. Is there anything else in the Oral Torah that frightened them to the extent that they would burn wagon loads of it? It seemed
Right.
like it's beyond just not having their followers not study it, but to burn it and get it out of our possession. It seemed like there's more to it than just what you mentioned.
Right, right. So that happens in the 13th century. So we're moving on now in time. We're moving through church history. So until the 13th century, the church concluded that the Jews just didn't understand their own Bible and understand certain passages in the Old Testament and were blind and were demonic, and that's why they didn't believe in Jesus. But as it turns out, I know this might surprise you, but some of the most vicious anti-Semites are Jewish. And it took a Jew who was a Karaite from Paris. His name is Nicholas Donnan, who first he becomes a Karaite, and he's expelled from the Paris ghetto in the 13th century. And he converts to Christianity, becomes a Dominican, and he comes up with something novel. And he said, all of you thought, he's saying this now to the church, that the reason why the Jew rejects Jesus is because they don't understand their Bible. You're all wrong. It's in fact the Talmud, the oral law that says blasphemy, expresses blasphemy against Jesus and Mary, and it's the Talmud that is the block. So until that point, the church didn't know anything about the Talmud. It's a very difficult book to begin with, even if you could read Aramaic, but but the church certainly had no access to it. Here, Nicholas Donnan just explodes, and he does that. He takes his case to the Pope, to Louis IX, the city of St. Louis, named after, who was a terrible anti-Semite, praised, and he makes that case. And the Talmud in France is put on trial in 12, and it was a kangaroo court. It never had a chance, where the Talmud was accused of stating blasphemy against Jesus and Mary. The Talmud, of course, loses, does not do well, and 24 crate loads of handwritten, as you point out, these were manuscripts, were burned in front of what is today the Louvre, which was the public execution. And it took 2 days because parchment doesn't burn. So every Talmud in France is destroyed. So that is a big movement right there, where it sort of goes nuclear.
And you're saying the Talmud contains information about Jesus, and that's what they were concerned about?
Right. So they claim that, so there are people in the Talmud who are called Yeshu, and these individuals are not spoken of in a flattering way. And I say individuals because we have one in the 1st century BCE and another one in the 2nd century. We don't have one in the 1st century. And the church claimed that this was in fact a blasphemy. These was really speaking about the Jesus of Christianity. The chief defense of the Talmud was expressed by Rabbi Singer of Paris. He was actually contributing author to Tosfot. Chief rabbi of Paris argued that this is not the Jesus of Christianity. It's someone else completely. And moreover, he didn't live when Jesus lived. Certainly not the same guy. The church was not convinced of this, but that was his chief argument. Is just not the same guy. It's a different time, a different place. The church would, and burning of the Talmud then became a cottage industry in the world. So it didn't stop in Paris. It continued. It continued throughout Europe. Burning Talmuds was a national pastime.
Is this where those stories originate that I have heard that there's this Jesus character learning under a rabbi, and the rabbi rebuked him,
Yes.
and and Jesus was going to come back in and he was going to forgive him, but he was in the middle of Shimon Esrei, if I'm remembering the story correctly, and then he ended up going off and going rogue. There's some story I remember listening to a rabbi tell this. Is this where this is coming from? From an area of our Talmud?
Yes, and that's just one example, but right, but that's the point. The rabbi that you're talking about is a man named Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia. Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia is a very famous Tana, meaning he's a contributing author to the Mishnah, and he lived in the first century, about 100 years BCE. So he did not live at the time of Jesus, but there is an individual named Yeshu, and just you'll go, oh, Yeshu. Well, Yeshu or Yeshua is just our equivalent of Josh. It's Yehoshua, but sort of truncated. It's
Right.
shortened. The story is that he had a student who made an unflattering remark about a woman's facial when entering an inn. His Rabbi Yeshua, was aghast, pointed out the woman had a facial deformity, and he threw him out. He expelled him. When this individual comes back to ask his rabbi, he was in the middle of saying Kriya Shema and did not interrupt. And he held his hand up because he was in the middle of prayer. This fellow Yeshu understands that to mean instead that I reject you, I don't want you. Now, why is the Talmud telling this story? Well, it's really important. The Talmud is there to tell us that you should push away with the left hand, but pull someone in with the right hand. While it's okay to criticize, make sure that when you're seeking to inspire your students, criticism is important, but make sure that your positive correction is stronger than your negative correction. That's what's learned out there. So, right, but that story places that Yeshu lived 100 years before Jesus of Christianity. That's the whole point.
Gotcha. And I think it's important for the listeners to know too that the Talmud is not a New York Times collection of stories that were happening at the time, but these stories were specifically recorded to teach different areas of halakha and law. Correct, Rabbi? Right.
It's the largest body of literature for me.
So is it possibly him, and that during the because there was some issues with them changing their calendar over multiple times, the Julius calendar to the Gregorian calendar, could that possibly have fit the timeline and have been about the Jesus that Christians now believe is the Messiah?
So the difference between the Julian and Gregorian count, by the time we get to the 16th, is an issue of 11 days. They knew it was off. This is occurring in the 13th century. This is a little bit earlier. This was Augustine's view was this, that the Jews don't understand their own Bible. And it was basically a statement saying, look, with all due respect to Augustine, who was our most revered doctor of the revered Latin church father, he was off on this one. And it's really the Talmud that was always the problem. We just didn't know anything about it. And this Jew is the informer that's there to say, it's the Talmud. I just could add a story, incidentally, which I think is so intriguing, I think it's valuable. In the early 16th century, there was another Jew who converts to Christianity. His name was Pfefferkorn. He was also in the south of France. He converts to Christianity, and he goes after the Jews wildly, and after the Talmud wildly, and makes all kinds of accusations. The Talmud encourages you to be killed and expelled in Talmud. And the Jews were just so fed up with this that they appealed to a Christian who was a Hebraist, whose name was Yohanan Ruchlin. So Yohanan Ruchlin was a brilliant Hebraist and really knew Hebrew and Talmudic literature and scripture. He was a genius. He's a very famous guy. He happened to like Jews. And the Jews said, can we have Ruchlin, this non-Jew, can we have him go through the Talmud, go through rabbinic literature, and check to see that what this Jew, apostate Jew, is saying is completely not true? And Ruchlin does precisely that by order of the church and comes back to report that actually there's nothing in the Talmud when rabbinic literature says anything bad about Jesus, and the Jews are right, and this Pfefferkorn guy is wrong. And so a non-Jew, like an Oscar Schindler guy, like just steps in and saves the Jews from an apostate Jew. It's an amazing story. So here we have a hero in the Christian world who was an absolute genius in rabbinic literature and Hebrew. There were people like that who just rose up, came out of nowhere, and just were philo-Semites and saved the day.
So this is it then. When it comes down to it, that's the issue. But it seems like we were defended. Did this animosity towards the Oral Torah, towards the Talmud, end at that point in time, or did it continue throughout history?
No, it continues throughout history and it continues to today. Whereas even today, the anti Semites make the most grotesque charges against the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud is our source of morality and guidance to what is pure and holy, but takes texts out of context, misquotes passages in order to make it look like it's completely vile and vulgar. And the Talmud is very susceptible to this. For those who, just for the audience, the reason why the Talmud is difficult to study, and it's not easy, is not just because it's written in Aramaic. That's not the problem. The reason why Talmud is easily misunderstood is because it's just missing thoughts which have to be added in by your teacher. It's just the way it's written. It's just, you get 3 words and you're supposed to figure out what that all means. And that's why rabbis are so eager to teach the Talmud, because otherwise you wouldn't know what's going on if you just read the text. But having a text like that has missing thoughts, like Art Scroll supplies those missing words in their translation, aside from the bold words, right? Well, the genius of what Art Scroll did was they're supplying the missing thoughts. And that's the work. It's not just so the Talmud, therefore, is very vulnerable to attack because it makes truncated statements and you have no idea if it's scribing something or proscribing something, no clue. And anti-Semites make use of this to attack the Judaism.
Because even if when it was written down, it was still oral. It still needed a student rabbi relationship in order to convey the deeper meaning behind the Talmud, correct?
I think that they were just so brilliant that they just presumed that of course you know what they mean. If you or you must have done this where you go on YouTube and watch a class in theoretical physics at MIT, and you could do that. You can just watch a Harvard professor, in nuclear chemistry, right? And within about one sentence, we're totally lost. We have no clue what's going on. We're going to just presume we don't know a lot about theoretical physics because the professor just assumes that if you're in MIT, that of course understand what he's saying. He doesn't have to explain it all out. So much is inferred. In Tanakh, this is the way as well. In Tanakh, there's a lot of words that are just missing that have to be added in for commentary because it's not they were on such a high level that they just said 2 or 3 words and they thought, of course, you know what they're referring to, and of course, what the context is. Of course. But in fact, it wasn't, of course. So, and that's why you have the Mishnah, where you have these authors who are from the 1st century BC to, let's say, the 2nd century CE. And then their students with the Amoraim, the next generation of rabbis from, let's say, the 3rd century, 6th century, who are going, Hacha b'may askinan. When our rabbi said that, like, under what circumstances did they mean that? They can't mean in all cases, of course. And so they're trying. So I think what you find in Talmudic literature is this, these people were just brilliant, but they would just say 2 or 3 words. They were very stingy with words. They just assumed you knew what they were talking about, the circumstances. But in fact, it required thousands of commentaries and you know this because you study Talmud, so you know this, that what all the commentaries are doing are just saying, when it says that, this is what it's really talking about and need to expand on it.
Is the other threat in the Talmud the fact that is where the topics like Mashiach and the role of Mashiach is found, like what Mashiach will accomplish when he does arrive, and that information would be an obvious threat to a Christian?
That's not the case. Because all the things that the Messiah will do, or what will occur in the Messianic age, are clearly in Tanakh. You don't need a Talmud for that.
Okay.
That the ingathering exiles, the worldwide knowledge of God, the building of the temple, the worldwide peace, it's all in Tanakh. So now it's not that the Talmud does not spend some time describing events that are precursor events. Like the last chapter of Tractate Sanhedrin is some of this, but it really isn't Tanakh. But Christianity had a problem, like other false Messiah movements, is that if your guy doesn't do anything in the Hebrew Bible, forget the Talmud, you then have to say that he's going to do it in a second coming, and the things that he accomplished, things that are unfalsifiable, verifiable, like born to a virgin in Bethlehem. Let's just forget about that. Isaiah 7:14 and Micah 5:2 are completely ripped out of context. Forget about it. Let's ignoring that. But
Right.
like, if Jesus wasn't born to a virgin, how would you know it today? There's no way, because he wasn't born in Bethlehem. You would have no way, that information wouldn't be accessible to. Conversely, if the resurrection of the dead occurred, if the building of the temple occurred, boy, would we know it today. So it's such a simple scam where you just have your putative Messiah fulfill things that are unfalsifiable, verifiable, and all the things that he hasn't accomplished, that's reserved for a second coming. That's the biggest red flag. So they use the enemy was Tanakh, but they came up with the solution of a second coming.
Gotcha. Okay. And this might be a little bit a deviation from our topic at hand, but I have always wanted to know, how do they reconcile the virgin birth and coming from the Davidic line if there was no human father? I never understood how they're able to.
Yeah, because you're too smart. That's the problem. You got to be sniffing glue and dial that your IQs
That
down a
has to
little
come
bit.
up, though. Of course, that
It
has to come up
does. It does.
with their
So for the
Christians. So
viewers,
how do they answer it?
oh, because for the viewer who's not may not follow you because like you're at a higher level. So the Messiah speaks from the house of David and from Judah, and you know what tribe you're from. So your father. So they'll try to get out of it that well, Mary was from the house of David, and Luke's genealogy is tracing Mary's genealogy, not Joseph's. This is pure nonsense because it's not the case. Luke's genealogy in chapter 3 is of Joseph, and Luke explicitly in chapter 1, verse 27 says it was Joseph rather than Mary from the house of David. Some might come up with the idea that Joseph adopted him, and which is even more ridiculous because who gave him up for adoption? So Mark Twain, who many regard as America's greatest writer and humorist, wrote that if you're telling the truth, you don't have to be very clever because you don't have to keep track of all your lies. Because you just get into all this trouble when you come with virgin birth stuff. They're all naughty answers. There's a curse in the genealogy in Matthew 1, and the virgin birth is to dodge the curse of Jeconiah, of Jeremiah 30:22-30. But if I didn't add this point, I would be remiss. 99.9% of the Christians would not think of this. It doesn't even occur to them. They would have no clue. I didn't even thought of that because they're not reading the Hebrew Bible. They're not familiar with it.
Interesting. I thought in the New Testament it lays out this Davidic line.
Yes, but this is the Davidic line of Joseph. And Joseph, so there are only two
Okay.
genealogies in the New Testament, Matthew 1, Luke 3. So as it turns out, these two books are the only two books that claim Jesus was conceived to a virgin. So therefore, and these two books are clearly attempting to trace the genealogy of Joseph, who's not the father of Jesus. So it's a complete waste of time. I mean, let alone the genealogies contradict each other
Okay.
in
And
wild
wait,
ways.
who was Joseph? Was Mary's father? Is
No,
that
it was Mary's putative husband, and he only comes up Matthew and Luke and John, but he's not mentioned in Mark. If he was a real historical figure, but we are told in Matthew, as an example, that Mary was engaged to him, was an arusa. It's more than engaged. She was betrothed to him. And it's during that intermediate year period between the heirs and the so between the betrothal and the actual living together that Joseph discovers that his wife is pregnant and wants to divorce her privately. So the character is portrayed as the putative husband who didn't yet sleep with his wife.
well, I'm so thankful she didn't have an affair on her husband.
Well, there were people who thought that she did. In fact, if you go, there was a second century pagan uh, thinker whose name was Celsus, who was a genius, who was fiercely anti-Christian, who insisted that Mary had an affair with a Roman soldier named Pondera. So this gets very interesting.
That's the best excuse for getting out of an extramarital affair I've ever heard. You gotta give credit where credit is due. So, what else can we take from this? I mean, again, if we're trying to arm ourselves with information that helps us in bringing Jews back to toward Judaism,
Right.
at basically making them impervious to these advances of Christianity, I guess what you've shared with us is very valuable. Is
Right.
educating Jews on some of this nonsensical stuff on why they hated the Oral Torah, because within there is says volumes about that there's the whole idea of Christianity is just nonsense. Is there any other
Right.
takeaways we should have on
Yeah,
this?
I wanted to share this with the viewer. So I would ask the question when we received the Torah, was it originally oral, or you probably think it's a trick question? The answer is transparent. It was originally given orally. And then at the very end of Moses, he's instructed in Deuteronomy 31 to write down the Torah. That's why there's no reference to the oral Torah in Tanakh. When I say reference, the Torah doesn't say, and make sure you follow the oral Torah, because the oral Torah is what everyone knew. The innovation was that anything should be written down. Now, missionaries play a game with this and go, why does the Torah say make sure you keep the oral Torah? The reason the oral Torah was the default. It's later on, write this all down. And so what's vital is that the Jewish people are the protectors of God's oracle, oral and then written. And we continue to protect these sacred oracles. And those who engaged in this study of our Torah are here with us today. Conversely, the Sadducees of old, none of you went to a public school with one. They don't exist anymore. They've disappeared. All the Jews that rejected the Oral Torah are no longer with us. They converted to Christianity 2,000 years ago. Their grandchildren are. God has protected only those Jews who kept the written and oral Torah and rejected the court ideas of Christianity. Only they're with us today. And there we see the hand of God, that the Jew is, in fact, a partner with God, in that God attests to the children of Israel, and conversely, the children of Israel attest to the God of Israel. It's a beautiful marriage.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things I had in my mind I wanted to ask you about, was the fact that the written Torah itself doesn't discuss Moshe Rabbeinu writing down the written Torah until the final verses. But
Right?
they talk about 40 years in wilderness, learning at the tent of meeting, and it
It
begs
was
the
all
question,
oral
what do you think
then.
they're teaching?
Right. So
You
it
know,
was all oral then. In fact,
right.
his earlier oral, I mean, how did Noah know what a clean animal and unclean animal was? When he was instructed to take 7 of the clean animals on the ark, he didn't have Leviticus 11 yet. It's transparently clear that the patriarchs or the progenitors of the Jewish people knew the commandments of the Torah, were very aware of it. So the Torah was oral, and it was an innovation. See, Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, 39, 31, 4, with Moses of blessed memory, at the very end of his life, writes 13 Torah scrolls, one for each tribe and one that goes in the Ark of the. And it's this Torah that is the fabric of our lives. And that's why Israel, the children of Israel, and the Eraisa, Achadu, the Torah are one. And we each attest to each other. It's really a marriage made in heaven.
Because if he was teaching the written Torah in the tent of meeting in the wilderness, then that may have stopped things like Korach's rebellion and other things as they were unfolding real time. So I'm sure that contradiction has come up in the Christian world too, because they're very familiar with our written Torah. It's part of their what they call the Old Testament.
Right, right. So when God gave the Torah to gave the Torah to Moses, he wasn't giving him all the stories that would happen. What we mean is that all the not only 613 commandments, but also all of the explanatory notes of what are tefillin, phylacteries, what are you supposed to bind to your arm and to your mind, and what does that all mean? So that all of its explanatory information was infused to the children of Israel orally, And then finally, the headlines. That's what this is very critical. The written Torah are basically the headline. You should keep Shabbos, don't do any work. But there's almost no information on what that work involves. Like what Yom Kippur, you should afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, but told nothing about, well, what do you do? Like, how do you supposed to beat yourself? Well, that's Oral Torah. Now you find that in Isaiah. I mean, it comes up that you fast on Yom Kippur. It comes up passingly in Isaiah 58. So just be very aware of the written Torah is the headline. You should afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, but Leviticus chapter 16, verse 31. But what does that mean? Like, what does that entail? And in case you think it's subjective, like whatever you think it is, no, because if the Torah says if you don't do that, it's the death penalty. So that had to be a very specific. There are 5 acts that we're not allowed to perform on Yom Kippur or engage in on Yom Kippur that entail that. It's not beating yourself over the head, or whipping yourself like the Shias do. No, it's very, very specific, and it had to be specific. And we find the Oral Torah all over the Nevi'im as well.
Right. Rabbi, I appreciate you coming on the show and educating us on why the Christians have had such an issue with our Oral Torah. I think, again, that empowers us as Jews as we reach out to our fellow Jews with information that we can use to bring them back to Torah Judaism. So thank you for sharing your tremendous wisdom with us, as always.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode and found it meaningful, please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast. To share feedback, suggest future topics, or ask questions for the host or his guests, you can email him at shamapodcastshow@gmail.com. That is shamapodcastshow@gmail.com, or click the show notes to join the growing WhatsApp community.